you're not crazy. You're not weak. And no, you're not the problem. Because if you look at your life from the outside, it almost makes sense. You tried to improve. You looked for answers. You paid attention. You became aware of your habits, your patterns, your flaws. You didn't ignore your life. You studied it. You learned about discipline, about mindset, about consistency. You understood what holds people back. You even understood what holds you back. And yet, something doesn't change. You still hesitate when it matters. Still delay the things that would actually move your life forward. Still find yourself circling around the same decisions again and again. And that creates a quiet kind of frustration. Because now, you can't even blame ignorance. You know what to do. That's what makes it worse. Have you ever noticed that? That strange moment where you're fully aware of what needs to happen and still don't move? Not because you're lazy, not because you don't care, but because something in you resists. So you try to fix it. You go back to learning, back to understanding, back to refining your approach. Another video, another idea, another explanation for why you feel stuck. And each time, it gives you something: clarity, relief, a sense that now you finally understand. But when the moment comes to act, that clarity disappears, and you're left with the same pattern: delay, avoidance, internal negotiation. And this is where things become difficult to explain, because from the outside, it looks like progress. You're thinking more deeply. You're becoming more self-aware. You're trying, but internally, your life isn't moving. And this creates a contradiction. How can someone be so aware and still so stuck? This is the part no one talks about. Because self-improvement is supposed to help you move forward. But sometimes, it does the opposite. It keeps you exactly where you are, not by stopping you, but by giving you the feeling of movement. And this is where the pattern begins. You don't act. You prepare. You don't risk. You analyze. You don't confront reality. You study it. And slowly, without noticing, you begin to replace action with understanding. Carl Jung described something close to this: a kind of psychological inflation, where a person begins to identify not with what they do, but with what they know. They feel transformed without ever transforming. And this is where the real problem begins. Because self-help at its extreme stops being a tool for change and becomes a substitute for it. You are no longer trying to change your life. You are trying to feel like the kind of person who could. And that feeling is enough to keep you where you are. But beneath that, there is something else, something quieter, something you don't want to look at directly. Because this pattern is not random. It is doing something for you. It is protecting you. And once you begin to see that, self-improvement stops looking like progress and starts revealing something much deeper. There's a specific version of you that keeps showing up. You don't notice it at first because it looks responsible. It looks like someone who cares, someone who's trying to get it right. You tell yourself you're just being thorough, just making sure you don't make the same mistakes again. But if you slow down and really watch it, there's a pattern. You don't move until you feel ready. You don't start until things feel clear. You don't act until the uncertainty is gone. And that moment never fully arrives. So instead, you prepare. You refine. You adjust. You gather more insight. You try to eliminate friction before it even appears. And on the surface, this feels intelligent. It feels like growth. But underneath, it's something else. Because while you're doing all of this, your life stays in the same place. This is what people in this pattern do. They become students of change instead of participants in it. They observe, they analyze, they understand, but they don't step into the part where things are unstable, where things are unclear, where things could go wrong. So they build a version of themselves that feels close to action, but never quite crosses into it. And over time, this becomes an identity. You become the person who is working on themselves, the one who is figuring things out, the one who is almost ready. And that identity is dangerous because it allows you to stay where you are without feeling like you're staying where you are. It gives your stagnation a narrative. It turns your inaction into a process. And once that happens, it becomes very difficult to see the truth, because now you're not avoiding your life. You're improving it. At least that's how it feels. But that's not the real pattern. Something deeper is happening here. Psychology has a name for parts of this. Avoidance disguised as preparation. Cognitive bypassing. Even what some would call productive procrastination. But those labels don't fully capture it. Because this isn't just about delaying tasks. It's about protecting identity. You're not just postponing action. You're postponing exposure. Exposure to uncertainty. Exposure to failure. Exposure to a version of yourself that might not match the one in your head. So instead, you stay in a controlled environment where everything makes sense, where everything can be understood, where you can feel like you're progressing without ever being tested. And the more you stay there, the more normal it feels, the more justified it feels. Until eventually you don't even question it anymore. It just becomes how you operate. You learn instead of doing. You plan instead of risking. You think instead of stepping in. And over time, this creates a gap between the person you understand yourself to be and the person you actually are in reality. And that gap is where the tension lives. That quiet discomfort you feel when nothing is technically wrong, but something isn't right. Because deep down, you can sense it. You can feel that your life is not moving in proportion to your awareness. And that's not an accident. That's the pattern. And this is where it becomes more serious. Because the longer this continues, the more your identity attaches to it. You start believing that this is just who you are. Someone thoughtful, someone introspective, someone who needs time. But that's not the full truth. Because there are moments, small ones, where the opportunity to act is right in front of you. Clear, simple, uncomplicated. And in those moments, you hesitate. Not because you don't know what to do, but because doing it would break the pattern. It would force you out of the role you've been playing, out of the observer, into something far less comfortable. Someone who can fail, someone who can be seen, someone who can be wrong. And that's the part you keep avoiding. Not consciously, but consistently. And once you begin to recognize this, you start to see something unsettling. This isn't just a habit. It's a structure, a way of relating to your life, a way of staying safe while convincing yourself you're moving forward. And the longer you stay inside that structure, the harder it becomes to leave. Because now, it doesn't feel like avoidance anymore. It feels like who you are. And that's where the real danger begins. It doesn't feel like fear. That's why it's hard to catch. Because when most people think of fear, they imagine something obvious. Nervousness, anxiety, overthinking that spirals out of control. But this isn't like that. This is quieter, more controlled, more reasonable. It sounds like logic. I just need a better plan. I should wait until I'm fully ready. I don't want to do this wrong. And when you hear those thoughts, they don't feel like avoidance. They feel intelligent, measured, responsible. But that's the disguise. Because underneath all of it, there's something much more primitive happening. Something your mind is trying to protect you from. And this is where it becomes uncomfortable. Because this pattern is not about improvement. It's about protection. Protection from what would happen if you acted without certainty. If you stepped in without knowing the outcome. If you tried and it exposed something about you you're not ready to face. So instead of moving forward, your mind creates a loop. Learn, understand, refine, repeat. And each time you go through that loop, you reduce the pressure. You feel like you're doing something, like you're getting closer. But you're not actually getting closer to action. You're getting further away from risk. And your mind prefers that. Because risk carries something dangerous. Not just failure, but meaning. Because if you try and fail, it forces a confrontation, not with a task, but with yourself. It raises questions you've been avoiding. Maybe I'm not as capable as I think. Maybe I don't have what it takes. Maybe this version of me isn't real. And that possibility is threatening, not to your goals, but to your identity. This is why you hesitate in those moments. Not because you don't know what to do, but because doing it would collapse something, an image, a belief, a version of yourself that feels safe as long as it's untested. And this is the mechanism. You are protecting a potential self by avoiding reality. You are preserving the idea of who you could be by never fully stepping into who you are. And self-help, when used this way, becomes the perfect tool for that, because it allows you to stay connected to that ideal version without ever risking losing it. You can listen, you can learn, you can imagine yourself becoming more disciplined, more confident, more focused. And for a moment, it feels real, but it's not. It's a simulation, a controlled environment where growth is imagined, but never tested. And this is where it becomes dangerous. Because the more you stay in that space, the more your mind starts to confuse. Thinking with doing, understanding with change. You start believing that awareness itself is enough. That if you just understand deeply enough, something will shift. But it doesn't. Because understanding doesn't threaten the system. Action does. Action introduces uncertainty. Action introduces feedback. Action introduces the possibility that things won't go the way you expect. And your mind is designed to avoid that. Not because it's weak, but because it's trying to protect you from pain, from embarrassment, from failure, from the emotional impact of being wrong, and most importantly, from the collapse of identity. Carl Jung spoke about this in a different way. The idea that we build an ego, a structured sense of self, that we try to maintain at all costs. And anything that threatens that structure, even something necessary, gets resisted, quietly, subtly, rationally. So instead of confronting that threat, you adapt around it. You stay in spaces where your identity feels intact, where you can still feel capable without being challenged, where you can still believe in your potential without risking disproving it. And this is why the cycle continues. Because every time you avoid action, you reinforce the belief that you're not ready yet. And every time you return to learning, you reinforce the idea that readiness is something you can achieve without exposure. But that's the illusion. Readiness doesn't come from understanding. It comes from contact. Contact with reality, with resistance, with failure, with feedback that doesn't match your expectations. And the longer you avoid that contact, the more fragile your sense of self becomes. Because it's no longer built on experience. It's built on possibility. And possibility feels good, but it doesn't hold under pressure. And this is the hidden mechanism. You're not stuck because you lack knowledge. You're stuck because knowledge is protecting you from something you don't want to feel. And until that changes, nothing else will. At first, this pattern feels harmless, even productive. You're learning. You're reflecting. You're becoming more aware of yourself. From the outside, it can even look impressive. You speak differently. You think more deeply. You notice things other people don't. But over time, something starts to shift. Not suddenly, quietly, almost invisibly. Your standards rise, but your actions don't. Your expectations become sharper, but your reality stays the same. And that gap begins to stretch. You start seeing more flaws in yourself, more inefficiencies, more things to fix. And instead of moving, you pause. Because now, everything feels like it needs to be optimized first. Everything feels like it needs to be understood more deeply. And slowly, you begin to hesitate, even in places that used to feel simple. Things that once required no thought now feel loaded, overanalyzed, heavy. And this is where the cost begins. Because the more you stay in your head, the less you trust yourself in reality. You start second-guessing decisions, replaying conversations, re-evaluating actions that have already passed. And with that, your sense of spontaneity disappears. Your natural instincts start to feel unreliable, so you compensate. You think more. You prepare more. You try to get ahead of every possible mistake, but it never feels like enough. Because the problem isn't the action. It's the relationship you've built with action. You've made it something that must be perfect. Something that must confirm who you believe yourself to be. And when that happens, every step carries pressure. Pressure to succeed. Pressure to validate yourself. Pressure to not break the image. And under that pressure, you slow down or you stop. And this is where the shadow reveals itself. Because what started as self-improvement turns into self-surveillance. You're not just living anymore. You're watching yourself live, constantly evaluating, constantly correcting, constantly asking, was that right? Did I do that well enough? Is this the best version of me? And that kind of awareness is not freedom. It's control. Rigid, tight, exhausting. You don't feel it all at once, but you notice it in small ways. You hesitate before speaking. You delay decisions that should be simple. You feel a low-level tension, even when nothing is wrong, because somewhere in the background, you're always being measured by yourself. And this is where identity begins to erode. Not because you're failing, but because you're no longer grounded in anything real. Your sense of self becomes abstract, based on ideas, standards, concepts of who you should be, not on lived experience, not on action, not on reality. And the longer this continues, the more disconnected you become from your instincts, from your confidence, from your ability to move without overthinking. You start needing clarity for things that used to require none. And without that clarity, you freeze. And this is the paradox. The more you try to improve yourself, the less natural you feel. The more you try to become better, the more restricted you become. And eventually, you reach a point where even starting feels heavy. Not because it's difficult, but because it means stepping out of the controlled space you've built and into something unpredictable, something that can't be fully understood beforehand, something that might expose you. And this is the part no one shows, because from the outside, you still look like someone who's working on themselves, someone who's thoughtful, disciplined, aware. But inside, You feel stuck, tired, fragmented, like you're carrying a version of yourself that you can't fully live up to. And this is where the real damage happens, not in failure, but in delay, in the slow erosion of momentum, in the gradual loss of trust in your own ability to act. Because every time you hesitate, every time you wait, every time you choose understanding over movement, you send a message to yourself. I'm not ready yet. And over time, you start to believe it. You start to build your identity around it. The one who is almost there, almost disciplined, almost confident, almost ready, but never fully in it. And that almost becomes permanent. This is not growth. This is stagnation with a narrative. This is not awareness. This is avoidance with structure. And the longer it goes on, the harder it becomes to see. Because now, it feels like who you are. And that's the shadow. Not the part of you that is broken, but the part of you that is hidden behind progress. The part that avoids reality, while convincing you it's preparing for it. And once that takes hold, you don't just stay stuck. You become someone who feels like they're evolving, while quietly standing still. This didn't start here. It only looks like a self-help problem on the surface. But the pattern goes back further than that. Before the books, before the videos, before you started analyzing yourself this way, there was already something in place. A sensitivity, a quiet awareness of being seen, being evaluated, being measured. You learned early that how you showed up mattered, not just what you did, but how well you did it, how acceptable it was, how it would be received. And because of that, you started paying attention to yourself, to your behavior, to your mistakes. You noticed what worked, what didn't, what got approval. And slowly, you adapted. Not in an obvious way, not consciously, but subtly. You became careful. Careful with how you acted. Careful with what you said. Careful with how you were perceived. And that carefulness felt necessary, because at some level, there was a cost to getting it wrong. Maybe it was criticism. Maybe it was rejection. Maybe it was disappointment. Or maybe it was something even quieter. A withdrawal of attention. A sense that who you were wasn't quite enough. So you learned something important. Something that stayed with you. That being right, being prepared, being good enough, kept you safe. And from that point on, you started building yourself around that idea. You didn't just act. You thought first. You evaluated first. You made sure first. And over time, that became normal. That became how you operated. So when you later found self-improvement, it didn't feel foreign. It felt familiar. It felt like an extension of something you were already doing. Refining yourself, improving yourself, becoming better, more acceptable, more controlled, more certain. And at first, it felt empowering, because now you had language for it, frameworks, concepts, explanations for why you felt the way you did, why you hesitated, why you overthought, why you wanted to get things right. And that understanding felt like progress. But underneath it, the original pattern was still there. The need to avoid getting it wrong, the need to avoid exposure, the need to maintain a certain image of yourself. So self-help didn't remove that pattern. It gave it structure. It gave it validation. It gave it a system to operate inside. Now, you weren't just being careful. You were being intentional. You weren't just hesitating. You were waiting for the right moment. You weren't avoiding risk. You were preparing properly. And that reframing made it almost impossible to question, because everything looked correct. Everything sounded right. Everything felt justified. But the underlying mechanism never changed. You were still protecting yourself, still avoiding situations where you might fail publicly, or feel inadequate, or confront something uncomfortable about yourself. And this is why the pattern feels so persistent. Because it's not just behavioral, it's emotional. It's rooted in memory, in past experiences where getting it wrong meant something, where it wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of who you were. And even if you've outgrown those environments, your nervous system hasn't fully let go. It still reacts the same way. It still prefers certainty over exposure, control over risk, understanding over action. Because those strategies worked once, they kept you safe. They helped you adapt. But now, they're holding you in place. And this is the difficult part to accept, because it means that what feels like growth is actually an extension of something much older, something protective, something that doesn't want to be challenged, because challenging it means stepping into the exact situations you learn to avoid. Situations where you might not perform well, where you might feel uncertain, where you might be seen without preparation, and that still feels threatening. Even now, even when logically you know it shouldn't. This is why awareness alone doesn't change it, because the pattern isn't built on logic. It's built on experience, on emotional memory, on a learned relationship with risk. And until that relationship shifts, you will keep returning to the same place, learning more, understanding more, refining more, but never fully stepping out, because stepping out means letting go of the protection, and that is what you've been avoiding all along. So what changes this? Not more insight, not another framework, not a better explanation, because you already have that. You already understand the pattern. You can see it now. The hesitation, the preparation, the constant return to thinking instead of doing. That's not the problem anymore. The problem is what you do next. Because this is where most people fall back. They recognize the pattern and then try to solve it the same way they created it. By thinking more, by analyzing it deeper, by trying to figure out the perfect way to break out of it. But that's still the pattern, just in a different form. So integration doesn't start with understanding. It starts with contact. Direct contact with the thing you've been avoiding. Small, uncontrolled, imperfect contact. Not when you feel ready, not when it makes sense, not when you've resolved the fear, but while it's still there. Especially while it's still there, because the goal is not to remove the resistance. The goal is to move with it, to act without resolving everything first. And that feels wrong. It feels premature. It feels like you're skipping steps, like you're about to make a mistake. But that's the point, because the version of you that waits for certainty is the version that stays stuck. So something has to shift, not in your knowledge, but in your relationship to action. Action is no longer something you prepare for. It becomes something you enter before you feel ready, before it feels clean, before it feels safe. And that changes something immediately, not externally, but internally, because the moment you act without full certainty, you interrupt the pattern. You break the loop. You step out of the controlled space and into reality. And reality is where things start to reorganize, not because you planned it perfectly, but because you finally gave yourself feedback, real feedback, not imagined outcomes, not theoretical scenarios, actual consequences, actual responses. And that does something your mind can't do on its own. It grounds you. It shows you what's real instead of what you think might happen. And most of the time, it's not as extreme as you expected. You don't collapse. You don't lose everything. You don't become the worst version of yourself. You just adjust. You correct. You continue. And slowly, your relationship with action changes. It becomes less about proving something and more about participating, less about protecting your identity and more about building it through experience. And this is where something important happens. You stop trying to feel like a certain kind of person and start becoming one. Not in your head, but in reality, through repetition, through exposure, through doing things that don't fully match the image you had of yourself. And that can feel uncomfortable because it means letting go of the idea of that you need to be fully prepared, fully certain, fully aligned before you begin. But that idea was never real. It was protection. And now you're choosing something else. Not confidence, not certainty, but willingness. Willingness to act while unsure. Willingness to move while imperfect. Willingness to see what actually happens instead of what you fear might happen. And that's where integration begins. Not in a dramatic shift, not in a moment of clarity, but in small, repeated decisions to step out of thought and into reality, again and again, until eventually it stops feeling like a risk and starts feeling like how you live. Not controlled, not optimized, but real. And this is the shift most people never make, because it requires something self-help rarely asks for. Letting go of the need to feel ready. Letting go of the need to understand everything first. Letting go of the version of yourself that only exists in your mind. And stepping into something far less certain, but far more honest. And once you do that, the pattern doesn't disappear, but it loses control. Because now, you're no longer waiting for the right moment. You're creating it through action. There's a version of you that still believes one more insight will fix this. One more realization. One more shift in perspective. One more moment of clarity. And everything will finally click. And for a while, that belief feels comforting. It gives you direction. It gives you something to hold on to. But if you're honest, you've been here before. You've had those moments where something makes sense, where everything feels clear, where you tell yourself, this is it. And then, nothing changes. Not because the insight was wrong, but because insight was never the missing piece. It just felt like it was, because it's safer to understand something than to step into it. Safer to think about change than to experience what it actually demands. And now you can see that, not as an idea, but as a pattern you've been living inside, quietly, consistently, without fully noticing it, until now. And this is where something shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly. You stop looking for the next explanation. You stop trying to resolve everything in your head. You stop waiting for that moment where you finally feel ready. And instead, you notice something simpler. The next action. Not the perfect one, not the complete one, just the real one. Right in front of you, uncomfortable, uncertain, unresolved. And you feel the resistance. Of course you do. That part hasn't disappeared. It still wants to delay, still wants to think, still wants to go back to what feels controlled. But now, you recognize it. You don't confuse it with logic anymore. You don't give it the same authority. You just see it for what it is. Protection. And for the first time, you don't follow it. Not completely. You pause, not to analyze, but to choose. And that choice is small, almost invisible. But it's different because this time you move anyway. Not because you're confident, not because you're ready, but because you understand something deeper now. That waiting hasn't been helping you. That thinking hasn't been changing anything. That clarity without action is just another form of delay. And once that becomes real to you, something quiet begins to settle. You stop trying to become someone else. You stop chasing that ideal version in your head. You stop measuring yourself against a standard that only exists in theory. And instead, you begin to relate to yourself differently. Not as a project, not as something to constantly fix, but as someone who can act even when it's unclear, even when it's imperfect, even when it doesn't match the image. And that's enough. Not perfect, not complete, but real. And for the first time, that feels different. Not exciting, not overwhelming, just grounded. Because you're no longer standing outside your life, trying to understand it. You're in it, participating, responding, adjusting. And that changes everything. Not instantly, not visibly, but fundamentally. Because now, you're no longer waiting to become the person who acts. You're acting and becoming that person at the same time. And there's no final moment where it all resolves. No clean transition, no version of you that arrives fully formed. Just this, a quiet shift from thinking to doing, from preparing to participating, from avoiding to facing, again and again. And maybe that's the part no one tells you. That growth doesn't feel like becoming something new. It feels like letting go of everything you were using to avoid it. And once you see that, you don't need another explanation. You don't need another system. You don't need another version of yourself. You just need to move, even slightly, even imperfectly, even now. And that's enough to begin.